Struggle, of course, is in a large part what the 20th century was about. It is a struggle between these three ideologies: capitalism, fascism, and communism. Fascism doesn't completely go away. I mean, there are people running around the world and the U.S. too today advocating some versions of fascism. They don't call it that, but the ideas are very much in common. Communism, in a very altered form, even from what it was in the beginning, still exists. But most of the 20th century you see is a big struggle between capitalism, fascism, and communism. So for the rest of chapter 27, it talks about the struggles that the Soviets had trying to modernize and industrialize Russia. Lenin, as soon as the Russian Civil War is over, Lenin is already ill. He has a series of strokes, is incapacitated pretty much for over a year, the last year and a half or so of his life, and dies in 1924. There was a big power struggle for the next few years between Stalin and Leon Trotsky, who was sort of Lenin's second in command. Trotsky was the guy who read books and figured out how to be a general and put the Red Army together. And through a very long struggle, Stalin wins. Stalin was a nobody in the party. Stalin was a bank robber, from Georgia, from the Soviet Georgia, the Russian Georgia. That through his political skills rose up the ladder and killed everybody that was against him and became the leader. And Stalin, of course, in 1927 pushes for a rapid industrialization and the atrocities that goes along with it. We all know that Stalin was a very brutal, dictator and all that stuff. But it's important for us to understand why. What was Stalin killing all these people for? Well, primarily to protect his own power, yes, but there was more to it than that. Stalin actually was a very, very brutal person. He killed every old Bolshevik and Russian revolutionary there was. But what Stalin was trying to do through the great crimes that he did in the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s was he was trying to rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union. And the only way to do this, of course, is to get money. How do you get money? Well, in most places in the world, capital accumulation goes on in antiquity. People generally did starve to death and die and suffer a whole lot so that wealthy people could have money to circulate around. And the Soviets have to do this very quickly. So they decide what they're going to do is get the peasants to grow grain, especially the Ukrainian peasants, to get them to grow grain, to confiscate that grain, all of it, not leave these people anything to eat. They starved to death in large numbers in the famine in the 20s and 30s. And they take that grain, sell it on the international market, get the money, and use that to fund the heavy industrialization and development of the Soviet Union. So that is the story behind all of the deaths and atrocities and gulags and death squads and purges that happened in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s under Stalin. It was partly an economic decision and partly Stalin's attempt to be the absolute dictator and control Russia. Now, of course, the Russians had absolutely no experience, zero, zip, zilch, zip, nada, no experience with democracy whatsoever. So it's no wonder that communism becomes an anti-democratic ideology because movements generally take on the characteristics of the societies in which they're born. So in China, which had no experience with democracy, in North Korea, which had no experience with democracy, in Russia, which had no experience with democracy, in Cuba, which had no experience with democracy, in all these places, these ideologies, communism, Marxism, Leninism, becomes, a non-democratic and, in essence, anti-democratic movement and stays that way. If it would have happened in England or the U.S. or France, it would have been a democratic movement more than likely, but it wasn't. And that's the fact of the 20th century of communism. So collectivization and all these policies are going on in the Soviet Union, the purges as well, and all this stuff is a political decision that Stalin personally makes and is backed up by the use of terror. And we've seen terror in history before, used in the French Revolution. Now it's used in the Soviet Union, and it's a very tragic period in history. But the explanation of it goes a little bit deeper than what one might think. So fascism in chapter 27. Again, in the last portion of the lecture, I talked about what fascism was. Fascism, first of all, what is fascism? We know what communism is. Society is supposed to be a commune, all things in common. What's fascism? Well, if you take out an American dime out of your pocket, and you look at that thing in the middle, it looks like a torch. It's actually a fasci. Fasces is an old Roman symbol of a bundle of rods, all right? So if you have one rod you can break it. But if you bundle several rods together and tie them up with twine or rope, you have a very strong rod. So strength through unity, right? Benito Mussolini uses this Roman symbol of the fasci to show strength through unity, right? So both communism and fascism are collectivist societies. They try to do away with sort of individualism and get people to work together for very different purposes. The collectivism is the only thing that communism and fascism has in common. Plus, of course, the use of violence and terror. But they're very different ideologies, and no matter what these news commentators who like to masquerade as historians falsely like to tell you, there's a very big difference between communism and fascism. The only two things they have in common are not part of their essential ideologies or so forth. So fascism is all about strength through unity, right? And that's what Mussolini comes up with. And he wants Italy, and Hitler later wants Germany to be very anti-Marxist, anti-democratic, anti-democracy, anti-internationalism, and racist, anti-Semitic, against whatever big, racial minority is within your midst. Communism was not supposed to be a dictatorship of one person. It was supposed to be a dictatorship of the proletariat, which in Marx's language means rule of the society by all the working class, not by one person, not by one party. But fascism was supposed to be a dictatorship of one person, the Führerprinzip, as they call it in Germany, the leadership principle, that the nation receives its strength through its unity by following one person. So in fascism, that is the way it was supposed to be. Fascists in power are very violent and very brutal. That brutality is part of the very nature of fascism, which again glorifies struggle, glorifies warfare, glorifies conflict, and glorifies emotion, not intellect. So fascism is an anti-enlightenment ideology. Don't think, feel. Don't think, act. That's what fascism is all about. But again, it's not a systematic ideology. It is very much a philosophy of action of the moment, not a philosophy at all. So in Germany, as in Italy, there are lots of economic problems that lead to the establishment of fascism, as well as just lingering bitterness and resentment after the war. It's no accident that the early fascists in Germany were returning World War I veterans. I mean, a lot of veterans of the First World War came home as communists, radicalized by the war, and a lot of other veterans came home as, what we'll later call Nazis, because they were radicalized in a right-wing way by the war. So what we see in the world in the 1920s, and especially during the Great Depression, is an increasing radicalization of Europe and the rest of the world between the extreme right and the extreme left as part of this big brew of what happens after the First World War. So there's a lot of experimentation going on all over the world. And the dictatorships, first in Italy and then in Germany, lead to the establishment of these fascist states. And of course, Hitler is the best known version of this. Very hyper-nationalistic, very against the spreading ideas of communism and democracy equally, and against the racial minorities in their midst. They are trying to imprint their societies with that one way of doing things. Mussolini takes over by a big march on Italy, and these black shirts, or in Germany the Stormtroopers, later the SS, the brown shirts, the black shirts, the SA, the SS. These were like the shock troops, right, of the fascist movement to force through their revolution or counter-revolution or whatever. In Germany, of course, it is the instability of the German state. Hitler is actually brought into power as chancellor. He's appointed on January 30th, 1933, and then through his political skill takes over the state and immediately starts to Germanize it or Aryanize it. And the Nazis, of course, start to attack the Jews in their midst. But their first crusade is not all about Judaism or Jews, which they see as a race again. The Nazis' primary appeal to people is that they are critical of the Versailles Treaty that holds Germany alone responsible. They talk about restoring national unity and national prestige. The Italians and the Germans both talked about that. And they really provoked everybody's fears about communism and about the changes in traditional morals and gender and so forth that the First World War caused. And the fascists, of course, promised to restore law and order. However, they're usually the people out there causing the violence in the streets in the first place. So more so in Germany than in Italy, there is this attempt throughout the 1930s to slowly purge their societies of these races and these minorities and so forth. In part 4, we'll talk about this a bit more.